a great historian and researcher from Israel. Haggai Erlich is a professor of Middle Eastern and African history at Tel Aviv University. He has written a number of books on Ethiopia, other African countries, and the Middle East. He is also the Landau Prize recipient for 2010 in African Studies, and of course, among other great achievements. Ladies and gentlemen, this is Addis Dialogue with me, Shifarao Lagao. We'll be spending some time with this great and distinguished professor. Do stay with us. Professor Haggai Erlich, it's really good to hear from you, and a very warm welcome to Addis Dialogue.
It's a pleasure, Shifarao. Thank you.
Many ask why Ethiopia, a Christian African kingdom between the Black Continent and the Muslim Middle East, managed to survive to modern times when other local civilizations crumbled in the face of European colonization. This seems to be the theme of almost all of your works on Ethiopia. You argue that Ethiopia has unique features. Can you explain this to us?
As you said, in all my works, and from the beginning when I started my interest in Ethiopia, this was the question that intrigued me, and I think intrigues everyone. Many philosophers and historians and observers ask themselves, what is the secret of Ethiopia? Mm-hmm. What is the mysterious magnetism which holds it together? And what is there that enabled this country, out of all civilizations in Africa and Asia, to survive as a political entity, to defend its sovereignty? I don't have one quick answer to that, but altogether there is something very unique about Ethiopia, and since I'll channel all my observation to one word, which is pride. Mm-hmm. Pride. It is in the roots of the civilization from late medieval times, from the establishment of Aksum as a political entity, from the adoption of Christianity as the cultural code, and so on. But altogether, there was one British observer that put it, there is a mysterious magnetism there. Mm. And we can go into sociological and cultural and whatever explanation. We don't have time into that, but the fact of the matter is that out of all civilization, the Ethiopian civilization, diversified as it is, you have the Amhara and the Tigrayans and the Oromos and whatever, but altogether there is something which holds this country together and enable her to face two of the most aggressive external powers in history, the power of political Islam, imperial Islam, and the power of modern European imperialism. To face up to those forces, retain sovereignty, and succeed in keeping independence. This is the secret of Ethiopia. No one solution to this.
Many local and provincial leaders, such as Ras Alula and Ras Suyum, and thousands of other local leaders, chose to throw their lot with kings and by extension for national unity. Why didn't they try taking advantage of their differences, and what do we learn from this?
As I said before, Ethiopia is a diverse world, and people would like to maintain their local entity and local inheritance, but still remain in the orbit of the Ethiopianness. And by my understanding, every time there was a crucial choice between belonging to the great thing called Ethiopia or seceding and creating something else
Mm-hmm.
in the crucial junctures, the strong leaders opted on remaining in Ethiopians,
Mm.
even though centrifugal forces were always there. But the way I understand, observing the Great World, being an Israeli and so on, diversity is also richness.
Mm-hmm.
And the internal dynamism created by the ongoing struggle between the sectarian and the collective is something that also contributes to the immunity and the strength of a society.
As a great historian with vast knowledge on both Ethiopia and Israel, how do you describe the ties between these two sister nations?
The sense of Israel was always there from the days of the myth of Queen of Sheba and King Solomon and all that. Ethiopian Christians always saw themselves not only successors of ancient Israel in spirit, like all other Christians, but also successors of Israel in flesh and blood. So it was a strong sense of attachment. And also from the Israeli Jewish point of view, the land of Ethiopia is a biblical entity, and all throughout history, modern times, modern Israel, Ethiopia is not only the part of Africa, which is very important, but also part of the periphery of the Middle East. Mm-hmm. And nowadays, the sense of attachment, the sense of closeness is stronger than ever before, because in Israel we have now 150,000 Ethiopians, the Beta Israel community, mm-hmm. who are part of Israeli dynamism. It's not only a rosy story, there are various difficulties there, but Ethiopianness is now part of Israel also. Mm-hmm. So I think the relations between the two countries are drawing on long history and the strong legacies for the present.
Some are pessimistic about Ethiopia, while others have optimistic view. Drawing on your rich expertise, what are your views here, and how do you see Ethiopia's future?
Well, I was born optimist, so excuse me for remaining so. Yeah. I think that the way Ethiopia survived for 2,000 years, in Hebrew we always say 2,000 years of Jewish exile, mm-hmm. But Ethiopia survived 2,000 years in Ethiopia with all difficulties and all the forces playing in the whole Ethiopian game. I think it will remain. Ethiopia is very, very much meaningful to all those born in Ethiopia, be them of whatever language and ethnical background. Mm-hmm. And Ethiopia is very, very important to the greater world, for the Jewish world, for the Christian world, for the Islamic world. Ethiopia is part of human, forgive me the romantic approach, but Ethiopia is very, very important to the world, and every Ethiopian would and should remain part of this Ethiopia.
Let's talk about your book entitled Haile Selassie, His Rise and His Fall. Why were you interested in writing a book about Ethiopia's last monarchy?
Well, when I began my studies on Ethiopia, it was back in 1970 in London, in the School of Oriental African Studies. Ethiopia was already under Haile Selassie. Mm-hmm. First time I came to Ethiopia was May 1970 with a group of students, and the emperor was still there. And ever since then, everything I wrote about modern Ethiopia, especially 20th century Ethiopia, the emperor was there. With all points of criticism about him, he was the most important Ethiopian of the 20th century. So it came to me that when I started my career, biographer of Ras Alula, to write a biography of Haile Selassie, it would be very, very exciting. The man not only managed to keep Ethiopia in his time united, he lived too long, and that was a liability. But at the peak of his career, he managed to keep Ethiopia, and at the same time, he was man of the world. He understood international affairs first and better than all other Ethiopians of his time. He understood that he should connect to the West, not only defend itself from the West. He understood that the Adwa victory had its advantages, but also that Europeans are not only enemies, that European civilization should be used to enhance Ethiopian modernization. So the whole book is a sort of a dialogue between Haile Selassie, the Christian king of Ethiopia, and Haile Selassie, man of the world. And in some chapters of the world history, he was a very important figure. In 1935, a crucial year for mankind, that was the year in which everything deteriorated towards the Second World War. Haile Selassie was chosen the Man of the Year by Time magazine. And he was the Man of the Year, the one who stood up to Mussolini and warned the world from succumbing to fascists like Mussolini and Hitler. So he was the conscience of the world. And the whole story, I divided my book into 3 chapters, chapters in the biblical writing of King Solomon. Song of Songs in his youth, Book of Proverbs in his mature age, and then the Book of Kohelet, we call it in Hebrew, the old man who who is vanishing towards the emptiness of death. So Haile Selassie was a great person and a great leader of Ethiopia. He lived too long. He controlled everything for 56 years. That's unheard of, and surely it left a legacy also of frustration and bitterness about it.
Many consider Ethiopia's history to be a complicated one, and its study far more difficult, as one has to solve many puzzles. What is your take on that?
It is quite a challenge for 2 reasons, big reasons. I can think of more. But one is to acquaint yourself with all the languages. I started when I was 30 to study Ethiopian history and to start learning some Amharic, but also you had to master French and Italian and English, of course, and all that. It was quite a challenge. But more than that, to try to decipher the complexity. We spoke before about the diversity of Ethiopia. Someone told me one day that every chapter in Ethiopian history is like a Shakespearean play. You have so many factors in the game, which is absolutely true, even though there were emperors that were supposed to be the rulers and with religious legitimacy to their power and so on. But every chapter is a very complicated game, perhaps more than other societies that I learn about, and it is quite a challenge to study Ethiopia, understand Ethiopia, the internal game, and Ethiopia connection to the greater world, to Africa, to the Middle East, and so on, and Europe. It is, but it's very rewarding because it's fascinating. One day I was asked by some prominent Ethiopian, what what did you find in us that you are so much interested in Ethiopia? And I relayed the question to my wife, and she told me, well, look at your friends. You can befriend only people of independent mind. You cannot befriend a yes man. I have to have someone proud to intrigue, to ignite your curiosity. And I think it is very, very rewarding to study about Ethiopia, even though it's not easy, as you said.
How should Ethiopians go about rectifying some of the contentious issues in their history in pursuit of unity and national consensus?
History is a good teacher that you have indeed 2,000 years of continuity, and you have to be patient about things, and also understand that every day there is a new chapter, and not to be too much captive of history. There is also in Ethiopia burden of history. For example, the main story, one of the main stories of today Ethiopia is the Renaissance Dam in relations to Egypt. There is a burden of 1,000 years between Ethiopians and Egyptians. I reconstructed it in my book, that Crossing the River, Egypt, Ethiopia, and the Nile. In my book, that Crossing the River, Egypt, Ethiopia, and the Nile. And it was all full of mutual suspicion and also mutual ignorance. Egyptians didn't bother to understand Ethiopia. The Ethiopians hardly bothered to understand Egypt. And the burden of this 1,000 years of mutual suspicion is always there today. I just give you an example, which is a very relevant one. I think that, of course, Egyptians should realize that Ethiopia is there and has its rights to its resources, and the Blue Nile, of course, part of it. And the Ethiopians also should realize what a trauma it is for the Egyptians to realize that the sources of the Nile are not only on the geographical map, but truly in the hands of Ethiopians, to study more about Ethiopia. I call it there, in my book, there is a blurred eye contact between Egypt and Ethiopia. And what I can contribute as an outside observer is the advice to clarify the mutual understanding by learning on the other. And history is very important. I find my living in writing it, but the burden of the past, of mutual suspicion, which is not only unique to Ethiopian-Egyptian relations, it's everywhere. Israelis and Arabs everywhere. But you have to cope with it and shed off the burden of mutual suspicion and restore confidence and mutual trust.
Talking about your book, you've written a book on Ethiopia, Egypt, and the Nile, entitled The Cross and the River, Ethiopia, Egypt, and the Nile. When you wrote the book, were you predicting that Ethiopia would someday be able to build a mega dam on the Nile River?
Well, fortunately, I'm not in the profession of predictions. Haggai, if you know your Bible, was a minor prophet. In the books of the minor prophet, a minor prophet. When I started my interest in the Nile as the connection between Egypt and Ethiopia, in fact, my colleague Israel Gershoni, an expert on Egypt, and myself, we organized 2 conferences in Tel Aviv. People came, scholars from Ethiopia, from Egypt, from the rest of the world. It was in 1997, the second one. And the main theme of the conference, all the scholars gathered together, is that there is a myth about Ethiopia resorting to the Blue Nile. In the past, it was just a myth, and in the future, it's not realistic.
Mm.
Then, in 2011, when Meles Zenawi started giving the green light for the plan that was there before, the idea was there before, but to start fulfilling it, yeah, I didn't know about that. I think most of Ethiopians didn't know about that, but that was high time for Ethiopia to start fulfilling this great challenge and the great enterprise of the Renaissance Dam. Now, if I was surprised or not, it's a marginal question. The Egyptians were surprised. For them, we lived 1,000 years with the Ethiopian toying with the idea and so on, but suddenly that it is there, and now 9 years later, it is really there. For them, and that's the thing that I'm talking to my Ethiopian friends, that you have to realize for the Egyptians, this is a major earthquake.
Mm.
It's turning the world around. The Nile is not only their life, it is also their soul. And suddenly, the notion that they no longer control the Nile, it's very strange to realize. So I think now I'm also following Egyptian history, the first response in Egypt was shock. It's like the process of the sudden death of a family member. The psychologist said, first you have shock, then you start realizing, then finally you have acceptance. I think that nowadays the good word is that the Egyptians now realize that this is the fact.
Mm.
It is there. And they have many concerns about the way the dam will be operated, not the very fact that the dam is there. At first they denied it, they were in a state of shock, they toyed with all the ideas of how to sabotage it. I don't think it's possible anymore. They are now realizing that it is there, and I can understand why there are so much concerns, and I wish the two sides build better trust between them about building the common future. Let me say a very relevant point. Today there are in Egypt, Ethiopia, Sudan, altogether close to 250 million people.
Mm.
In a generation from now, all predictions are that there will be 500,000 million people.
Mm.
Mother Nature is not that considerate. There will be no more water than today. And even today there is scarcity. In the future, if we men do not build the future, realizing that Mother Nature will be very cruel. So I think, and this is a sentence I think should be remembered. The Renaissance dam is the right dam in the right place. It is where my friends, the geographers say, in future there will be water in the Ethiopian basin of the Blue Nile.
Mm.
The White Nile is about to disappear. And my understanding between Egyptians and Ethiopians, that at least there will be waters to quarrel about.
Mm.
So in a way, it is the right dam in the right place. By the way, as from the beginning of the 20th century, the British wanted the water tower of the Nile Basin to be a dam in Lake Tana.
Mm-hmm.
Haile Selassie would not let them in for good reasons. He invited Americans to make a survey, and the Americans made the survey and advised on the dam roughly where the Renaissance Dam is today.
Mm-hmm.
But if you see the old Nile Basin, this is the place to have more water, to keep them, to avoid evaporation and siltation and what have you, and produce electricity, of course, and there will be enough water for the Egyptians also, for the Sudanese also, for the Ethiopians also to go on quarreling about it, but at least there will be a source of life to quarrel about.
Mm. Now that Ethiopia has built its dam in this generation, do you think that it is long overdue, in your view, given that previous leaders also wanted to build a dam in the Nile?
Yeah, when I looked at the history, and as you said, when I wrote the Crossing the River in the year 2000, I didn't realize it's going to be built. But when I look at the time of Menelik, of Haile Selassie, and of Mengistu, each one of them wasted the time, threatening the Egyptians, playing the idea as a card in external relations, but they did nothing. So you're right, it's high time, which came in 2011, and the Ethiopians, look, in 2000, when I was writing the Crossing the River, the World Bank issued a survey, and it defined the Blue Nile as #1 source, economic source of Ethiopia.
Mm-hmm.
So to let the river run from the beginning of history of mankind, just stealing the waters away, just stealing the soil of Ethiopia to Egypt. By the way, they said that Egypt is the gift of the Nile. Egypt is also the gift of Ethiopia. You have to dig 6-8 meters in the delta of Egypt to reach soil which is not imported from Ethiopia, thanks to the Nile. So for the Ethiopians to start using it, as you said, it was long overdue to do so. But in the same breath, I have to emphasize to be as considerate as possible with the fact that for the Egyptians, it is also a matter of spiritual and material life.
Egypt says it has historical rights on the River Nile. Is there such a thing as historical rights when it comes to transboundary river?
Well, there were always, not always, in modern times, two concepts about the usage of international rivers. One was historical rights, that we were first, we built our civilization on the waters of the river, and therefore, since we were the first, no one should interfere upstream with that. But there is another concept relating to rivers international policy, which is titled equitable share. That every riparian country should have its proper share in the water, no matter what is history, talking about the future. So the main rivers in the world, if you take the Danube in Europe and so on, everything is settled along this equitable share principle. And Ethiopians always, when the discussions started, they argue the equitable share principle. The rest of the African Nile countries join them. Egypt is still following the principle of historical rights, but I don't think it is a valid argument anymore.
Ethiopia contends that Egypt is still hanging on to colonial agreements when it comes to the River Nile. What's your take on that?
The British in their time occupied Egypt and Sudan and wanted the All Nile Dam to be built in Ethiopia. But the Ethiopian refused to let him in. So the British, in a way, developed anger at Ethiopia. It's a long history and very, very much important. So they arranged, the British, the rulers of Egypt and the rulers of Sudan, but it was in between them. In 1929, the so-called agreement that Egypt is owner of the Nile. It allots to the Sudanese this and this quota. I can bother you with the number, it's not important. But and they ignored Ethiopia. The British were the masters of the whole thing. It was a colonial arrangement between the ruled countries. And then in 1955, under Gamal Abdel Nasser, the Egyptians renewed this agreement. In both, the wording are not that much important. The principle was that Ethiopia was virtually ignored. The country that supplied 4/5 of the water of the Nile was simply ignored. No doubt it was the inheritance of colonial times. African countries inherited the boundaries, but not the spirit of colonialism. And the concept that this was the international agreement and so on, no, there should be a new agreement and along the spirit of building the future, not inheriting colonial times.
Some say Egypt has been tirelessly working to put every conceivable obstacle to Ethiopia's efforts to erect a dam on the Nile. What are your views on that?
There were all those stories about the past that the Egyptians were trying to undermine the unity of Ethiopia and so on. Maybe part of it was right about the long past. When it came to real politics, I'm not that sure. There was always the suspicion that the Egyptians used the Muslims of Ethiopia to undermine the Ethiopian government, that the Ethiopians used the Copts in Egypt to undermine Egypt. All sorts of suspicious ideas were there. After the Renaissance dam was known, the Egyptians, they underwent some changes. As you know, Mubarak was toppled in a year. From that, the Muslim Brothers government of Muhammad Morsi came. They toyed with all the ideas of undermining Ethiopia this way or another, and even the idea of building threatening military power. The way I see it, of course, they still are panicking about the concept that Ethiopia will control the Nile, but I think they realized, they came to terms with the very fact that the dam is there, and undermining or, God forbid, launch a war about it is not realistic.
Well, Professor Haggai Erlich, many thanks for your perspectives. It was really great hearing from you, and I hope we will meet sometime again in the future.
It's a pleasure, Shivarao. Thank you.
Well, dear viewers, that was Professor Haggai Erlich talking to us in this edition of this dialogue. Many thanks for your company so far. Until I see you with another program, it's goodbye from me, Shifar Alak.